Hello.
This is Dean Harrison here calling you from Sick and Wrong. Thanks for being on the show. Norman's the author of Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich, and very fascinating topic.
Norman Ohler.
Yeah, Norman Ohler. A very fascinating topic, and one that we're very interested in chatting with you about.
Yeah, it's a book that just recently got translated into English, and it's actually a New York Times bestseller.
Oh, nice.
Mm-hmm. So, Norman, you were a novelist. This is actually your first book that's like a nonfiction history book.
Correct.
What started you down on this path? Like, what made you sort of delve into all the research about drug use in the Third Reich and then said, okay, I'm going to write a whole book on this?
Well, I thought it would be good to do some research even for a novel, and I found the notes of Theo Morell, Hitler's personal physician, in the Federal Archives in West Germany. And when I read through these notes, I realized it's actually very difficult to invent something because the true story is so unusual and so rich in detail that it made more sense to switch genres and continue on the path of doing sort of academic research and writing a nonfiction book.
So tell our listeners, and this was kind of just the most striking thing about the whole book to me, was the idea of the Volksdroge, which was basically methamphetamine in pill form that they sold as a drug called Pervitin.
Yeah.
If you could just give a little overview to our listeners about how that worked.
Well, it was very curious because the Nazis were the first anti-drug regime in Germany and nearly in Europe. I mean, they were very strict. They were very strict rules against drug use when they took power. Like, drug users were thrown in concentration camps in 1933 and 1934. But then after the Olympic Games, there was a company in Berlin called Temmler, which developed a new stimulant that was seen as a legal way to increase your mood and give you extra strength, and it contained pure methamphetamine. Basically, they invented methamphetamine or turned it into a product, and this became hugely popular in Germany. No one thought in the first couple of years it was on the market that this also could be a drug or could be habit forming. So Pervitin use was quite accepted in the Third Reich. There were even chocolates on the market which contained pure methamphetamine.
So did the Nazis view Pervitin as a narcotic or as a drug?
No, it was like you would take a pill instead of drinking coffee. I mean, at the time there weren't a lot of stimulants actually available like today, where you can just go to a coffee shop and have a latte macchiato. This didn't exist at the time, but at the same time, people needed something to kind of craved something that would give them a little boost in their stressful day in the dictatorship or in the modern fascist society. So Pervitin became popular without anybody thinking that it's a strange thing to take methamphetamine in the morning or before a business meeting.
Well, was it also hugely profitable at the time for the company that created it?
Well, for the company, it was a great success. I mean, they expanded and became a big player, and they're actually still a big player today in the pharmaceutical world, and all of their success is based on methamphetamine.
You mentioned in the book that it was actually cheaper than coffee.
Yeah, much cheaper. I mean, coffee was not so available, especially when the war started. It was rationed. It was very hard to actually get a cup of coffee. The army made a calculation saying that to keep a soldier awake for the whole night with coffee cost, I think it was like 51 cents, and if you just give the soldier Pervitin, methamphetamine, it only cost like 7 cents. So the calculation was pretty clear.
How did they market it? How did Temmler market the drug to the people?
Well, Temmler wasn't really sure what it's good for. Their chief chemist who developed it and also took it himself just reported that it feels really good to take it and you have more energy. But they weren't really sure what diseases it's good for. So they basically said it's good for anything. It was considered like a cure-all. It was against fatigue, or if you also sexual fatigue. It was marketed as stimulating your libido. It was supposed to be good against hay fever. It was supposed to be good against anything, basically.
It's an all-around panacea. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So how does it differ from modern-day meth or methamphetamine? Or is it pretty much the same thing?
Well, I mean, the Germans perfected it. It was probably much better than what is being cooked up in some illegal labs somewhere in Eastern Europe or in the south of the United States, or wherever it's made in the U.S. I mean, this was made in a proper lab of a pharmaceutical company, and so it was probably not as dangerous to your health, but certainly it was still a dangerous drug that makes you addicted after a while.
More pure than Walter White's meth.
Yeah.
For sure. It's probably the purest meth that ever existed.
You mentioned in the book that it was also recommended for use in frigid women.
Well, yeah, I mean, Temlam recommended it. I think 2 tablets would increase your sexual appetite. I mean, they marketed across the board, and they wrote to doctors. They sent free pills to all the doctors in Germany in the beginning, saying, take it, try it out, tell us what it's good for, because they weren't sure. So it was really used for anything and nothing.
So whose idea was to start using it for soldiers? Like, did Temmler pitch it to the Nazis and they're like, yeah, this is a great idea? Like, how'd that come about?
Well, I mean, we have to understand that the army was not necessarily a Nazi organization, but it was a state organization. It was the Army of Germany. So the guy who developed it was actually not really a Nazi. He was a professor working for the army who was responsible for performance enhancement of the army, and he read reports from German universities saying that with methamphetamine you need to sleep less, and it also reduces your fear levels. So they made experiments at universities, tests. Mostly professors took it themselves and kind of wrote down how they felt. So he suggested it to the Surgeon General of the army, saying we should use this. So this is kind of how it made the way into the army. He made tests among young medical officers in Berlin before the war started, and realized that they can stay awake longer. So he thought it's a good thing.
The German, the Wehrmacht, the German army, they actually bought it at one point, around 1940, and encouraged its use, or indicated that soldiers should take it?
Yeah, I mean, they were the first army in the world to encourage the use of a synthetic drug, which was methamphetamine. They issued the so-called stimulant decree in April 1940, just before Germany invaded Western countries in Europe. And the first order was 35 million tablets of methamphetamine that were being used in that so-called Blitzkrieg advance that surprised the Great Britain and France in May 1940.
This was actually one of the craziest revelations for me in the book, was that Pervitin was largely, it seemed like it was a major part of the invasion of France, because I guess the invasion of France involved them driving tanks over mountains for something like 36 hours and then still being alert enough to attack people after that.
Yeah, this was unheard of at the time, and Winston Churchill made the big mistake of trying to calm down the nerves of his French colleague who said, like, the Germans are like not stopping for 2 days now, and Churchill said, well, but they will have to rest, because a human being needs to sleep. So even in a big group like in an army, there's resting periods where you need to basically pitch and sleep for a while, and then the next morning you continue. But the difference here was that the Germans managed to not stop for a couple of days and nights until they reached Sedan. And by reaching that city so quickly, they cut off troops which were in the north in Belgium and in more to the south. So the Germans kind of cut through that. This was the sickle cut. So methamphetamine played a huge role in this, but it was also the strategy to go through the mountains. So it's not like an unprepared army just takes drugs and is suddenly very successful. I mean, the whole organization, which included the use of methamphetamine, was very successful. But without methamphetamine, maybe the whole, I try to examine how exactly the drug kind of fits into that overall strategy and makes it actually work.
One other thing that struck me, you talk about, the halt order or the Dunkirk miracle, because last year there were 2 movies about this. There was Dunkirk, and then there was the Winston Churchill movie, Darkest Hour. And nobody really, because they had the British Army on the ropes at Dunkirk, and they could have wiped out 300,000 British soldiers, and for some reason they stopped. And in the book you kind of lay out this idea that Göring, while the Reichsmarshal Göring, who ran the Luftwaffe, while really high on morphine, gave this idea to Hitler that they could take credit for it easier if he wiped out the troops with his planes.
Yeah, I mean, Dunkirk is really mysterious, and these films that were made completely missed out the German side, which is probably the most interesting, because the decision seems to be completely irrational not to kind of finish the job and finish off with Great Britain, because they could have done so. And in fact, Göring said, I can do it with the Luftwaffe, and Hitler didn't really understand how his methamphetamine doped tank generals like Rommel, how they were moving and why they were moving so fast. So he tried to get back in control of the situation and ordered his tanks to stop. So this is a pharmacological explanation or an attempt to explain, but I think there's different things that come into play here. Also, Hitler was very reluctant actually to finish off Great Britain and to actually be victorious over Great Britain, because the West, England and the United States had supported him and had kind of helped him to come into power. And so it's a very mysterious case, actually.
So, Norman, I have a question here. So, your book, you mentioned Pervitin quite a bit, but how did that differ from the other methamphetamine-based experimental performance drug, D9? What was D9, I guess, compared to Pervitin, and how often was it used?
Well, Pervitin was the main drug that's methamphetamine that was used by hundreds of it was used in hundreds of millions of dosages, so millions of soldiers were using it more or less often. I mean, this depended also on what unit you were in and what situation you were in, but this was the common drug of the Wehrmacht. D9 was an attempt by the German Navy late in the war to develop a drug that's more powerful than methamphetamine, because they were developing new mini submarines, which were supposed to be underwater for up to a week, manned by only one person or
Wow.
two people. And they obviously couldn't sleep, at least if it was a one-person mini submarine. It was it would have cost you your life to actually fall asleep. So they tried different combinations, drug combinations. They had 10 different drug combinations, and then just called it D1 to D10. And D9, drug 9, was the most potent of those. It contained methamphetamine, cocaine, and what is now called oxycodone.
Oxycodone. Eucodol, right? The drug that's now pretty much oxycodone.
Yeah, Eucodol was a German brand name, so it combined these 3 highly potent drugs. But D9 was so powerful that it actually overpowered the soldiers who took it. So it was not that successful, and kind of shows the limit of what you can do to a person to push him to a higher performance in war. So D9 was in a way a failure.
Those mini subs, it was the craziest thing about it is that they were kind of pitching it as something that was going to turn the war around. But the thing is that it was, I think they were called Seahoons, the submarines, but they were basically just giving teenagers, because they were mostly teenagers, a bunch of meth, putting them in submarines, even though they really didn't even know how to drive submarines, and being like, okay, go attack some ships on a suicide mission with your one torpedo.
Yeah, I mean, these missions are totally insane, and Hitler was always hinting at having so-called miracle weapons up his sleeve, and these mini submarines were supposed to be these miracle weapons or part of this miracle weapon arsenal. But basically, it was a completely helpless attempt to turn the war around in 1944, where it was clear that the war could not be turned around, except maybe with a nuclear bomb. But this weapon was not available to Hitler because he thought nuclear bomb is a Jewish thing, so he didn't really go into development of that technology. So actually, after the war was already over on the 8th of May 1945, and some of these mini submarines were still underwater. The pilots totally drugged, not even aware that the war had already ended, still floating through the Atlantic, totally doped up.
Very interesting. So, Norman, you use the term polytoxicomania to describe Hitler's drug addiction. What do you mean by that?
Well, to the outside world, in Germany especially, Hitler was portrayed as an abstinent person who didn't drink, was a vegetarian, didn't even consume coffee, no cigarettes, a pure health saint, basically. But if you look at the notes of Theo Morel, his personal physician, the complete opposite appears as the truth, because Morel gave Hitler daily injections from 1936 to 1945 and changed the cocktail of those injections over time. And from 41 on, Hitler receives quite a few opioids and steroids in his daily injections, combined with vitamins and other things. So he consumes over 90 different medications on a regular level, on a daily level, actually, without being sick. So he turns into a complete drug freak, basically.
What would you say, like in 1944, say after the attempt on his life, the Operation Valkyrie, what would you say those injections consisted of, the ones he took daily that his doctor, Dr. Morel, gave him?
Well, after for the first time, Hitler tried Eukodal, OxyContin, in July 1943, and he really liked it. And after the bomb attack in 44, he takes it every other day in a dosage of 20 milligrams intravenously, which is quite a high dosage, actually very high dosage. So this euphoric-making opioid becomes his favorite drug. He also takes quite a bit of cocaine after the bomb attack for about 2.5 months. He takes cocaine over 50 times in high dosages. So he's using cocaine and this opioid in a way at the same time, kind of taking a speedball. What we today would speedball. So he was really on drugs in that second half of 1944. There was no sober day anymore.
So a lot of people comment on Hitler's unwavering optimism, even though they're suffering many military setbacks. Do you think this has to do with his drug addiction? Like, was it completely clouding his reason and his judgment?
Well, I mean, his judgment was completely clouded by his ideology, which was far removed from reality and was, in a way, working in the first years of his job as the Führer of Germany, but certainly didn't work once he started attacking the Soviet Union, when his world became more and more a world of make-believe. And so it makes all the sense in the world that he would use an opioid that made him euphoric and kind of reinforced his unrealistic worldviews, which resulted in completely unrealistic orders that he would give in the war. So his drug use later on contributed to his fatal clinging to his old views, which were not really helping him or the German war effort anymore.
Yeah, one thing you actually kind of briefly touch on in the book is that the Nazis were doing testing with mescaline to get, as an interrogation method, even kind of a mind control method, and that's actually what inspired the CIA's MK Ultra program with LSD.
Yeah, that's one of the more interesting findings, I think, in the book.
Did you find that specifically when you were going through all the records?
Well, I found that in concentration camp of Dachau, where the Nazis made these mescaline experiments. So, yeah. What
drugs were tested on concentration camp prisoners?
Well, there were two programs. One was the mescaline program that you mentioned, and the other one was the D9 program that was done in concentration camp of Sachsenhausen, where they tried to find a drug that basically keeps you going. So before they gave it to the young Navy pilots in the mini-submarines, they tested different drug combinations on concentration camp inmates, made them walk in circles with heavy backpacks for like 20 hours or as long as they could, and just checked out which drug keeps a concentration camp inmate on his feet for the longest.
Why do you think that no one has written this book until now? Because there are a lot of really interesting revelations here that, I feel like no one, like all this information was available, but no one's really... Why do you think you're the first one to actually put all this together?
Well, I mean, it's hard for me to say because I put it together, so why would a historian miss out? I mean, maybe they're too square or too unexperienced to evaluate how drug use can have an influence. Also, historical sciences are, they're changing, and new angles are coming up, and it just took up until now for someone like me coming from outside and having maybe more of an open mind or a fresh view on the subject to make an investigation here.
Yeah, it almost seemed like like people can accept the Nazis doing what they did based on ideology, but it's like if they're also toe up from the flow up on fucking crystal meth, people might have a hard time dealing with that. It seemed like, like the public might have a hard time swallowing that.
Yeah, it's hard for historians to get their head around it. So the ones who are able to do that really appreciate Blitzed, while some others just don't get it, or they're just also a little bit ashamed, I think, that they missed out on the story, or that they just overlooked it. Especially people who wrote a lot about Hitler should have realized that he spent every day with Morell, and that Morell gave him very powerful injections, and to not examine that is probably a mistake.
You mentioned in the acknowledgments of Blitzed that Michael Stipe from Aryan actually helped you come up with the English title?
Yeah, I mean, my English publisher wanted to call the book Totally Blitzed, and I told them, you should lose the totally. And they said, no, we had discussions with our creative team, and it's Totally Blitzed is a perfect title. And I was invited to a dinner that night at a friend's house, Douglas Gordon, a British artist who lives in Berlin, and he told me that Michael Stipe would be there, but then I didn't see Michael Stipe at the dinner, but I said to Douglas, Michael's not here, I suppose. But then he pointed to a gentleman sitting in the corner, and he said, well, over there's Michael Stipe. So I approached him, and he was immediately interested in my work, and he just said, should be called Blitzed, and if your publisher changes it to Blitz, I'm going to write a song about that. And when I told Penguin this the next day, they actually listened to Michael Stipe and changed it to Blitz, which I think is a good decision.
Yeah, I think it's a great title. All right, Norman, we've taken up enough of your time. I want to wish you safe travels, because you're in India right now, right?
Yeah, I'm on a reading tour in India right now.
Where are you going next?
I'm actually going to Jaipur, which is supposedly one of the most important literary festivals. So I'm going there today to give a talk on Blitz. So let's see how that goes.
All right. Well, thanks for being on the show. People, you can go check out Blitzed, Drugs in the Third Reich, available on Amazon and other retailers of fine literary works.
And
Norman,
he's
thanks
Norman
a lot.
Ohler on Twitter. OHLER.
All right. Thank you, Norman.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks so much.